Okay, so hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to our first CRAE webinar of the new academic year. It's really lovely to see lots of familiar names in the attendees list, but also some not so familiar names as well. So whether this is your first time at a CRAE event, whether you have a really close connection to us, or whether you're kind of somewhere along that spectrum, it's really wonderful to have you here. For those of you who are new to CRAE, and maybe as a refresher to those who are more familiar with us, my name is Laura Crane, and I'm currently stepping in as the director of CRAE while my colleague Anna Remington is on maternity leave. And CRAE is the Centre for Research in Autism Education, which is based at UCL's Institute of Education in London in the UK. And CRAE comprises a team of both autistic and non-autistic staff and students. And our goal and our ethos is to conduct really high quality research. But importantly, we aim for that research to be on topics that matter to autistic people and their allies, to make a difference to the lives of autistic people and their allies, and really crucially, to meaningfully involve them in designing, developing, conducting, and sharing that research. So we take a really participatory approach in all that we do. And we're also very committed to making sure that academic research on autism is shared beyond academia, and that everyone can engage with our work, but also that of other research teams in a really engaging and accessible way. And that's one of the reasons that we set up this CRAE webinar series, to showcase the work of some of the leading autism researchers and advocates in the field to an audience that kind of includes but also goes beyond academia. And at this point, I just want to say a particular thank you to all of our funders and supporters and our team members who make these events possible, and particularly to the Pears Foundation, who really generously support our work at CRAE, and without whom these kinds of events just wouldn't be possible. So that's a little about our centre and about our values. And I'm really delighted now to introduce you to our speakers for today's webinar, who are Kristen Bottema-Beutel and Shannon Crowley, who are from the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College in the US. Now, I could give them an introduction showcasing all the amazing work that is being done by Kristen and Shannon, their colleagues in Boston. Things like their really important paper on avoiding ableist language in autism research, or the brilliant Project AIM, which has been flagging some really important issues in relation to the quality of research on autism intervention. But if I went into detail about all of their brilliant work, it would probably take up the whole hour. But what I will say is just how delighted we are to have two researchers with such a strong commitment to really raising the standards of autism research and the ethical integrity of that research, which I think are particularly important to make sure that autistic people get the research that they deserve. So thank you both so much for taking the time to share your work with CRAE and with our broader community today. On that note, I'll hand you over to Kristen and Shannon, but just to mention that we hope to have a bit of time at the end for questions. You're welcome to put the questions in the chat or the Q&A, but we also have a website called Slido, because we know that some people prefer to post questions anonymously. So the link to the Slido, if you prefer to use that, goes in the chat now, but you can absolutely use the Q&A or the chat box if you prefer, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So thank you again to Kristen and Shannon, and we really look forward to your talk on evaluating intervention research for transition age autistic youth.
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So thank you everyone for attending. We're really excited to be able to present some of our work that we're just finishing up. As Laura mentioned, our talk today is evaluating intervention research for transition age autistic youth. And let's see, let's make sure I can, okay. So I'm going to start this talk by just giving some background about transition services for autistic youth. And then I will show some survey research on how autistic youth are doing as they exit school and what kinds of things they're doing. And then I'll talk about an existing framework for evaluating autism intervention research, and with a specific eye toward how our project differs from current approaches for evaluation. And then I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. She's going to discuss this study that we're almost completing. We're just wrapping up the coding for it. She'll talk about the methods and what we found, and then I'll take it back again and talk about some of our conclusions from that work. So transition services are services provided when high school students who receive special education supports are in their, they're in the period where they're, most of the time they're in high school, but we're thinking about school exit. So in the US, the education law that mandates transition services for students with disabilities is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And in that law, the reference to transition says that transition services have to be focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported employment, continuing in adult education, adult services, independent living, or community participation. So in the US, this federal law mandates that transition services have to start no later than when students are 16. States, individual states do have some leeway. They can actually move this back a little bit. So some states, including Massachusetts, where Shannon and I are, the transition period actually starts at 14. And the transition period extends until students exit school. So in the US, that's when they turn 22, when they are no longer eligible for K-12 school services. So we know that in the US, and I would imagine this is probably true in the UK as well, when students with disabilities exit school, the supports that are available to them drop off dramatically. So they might have been receiving substantial support in their K-12 experience, but this does not go with them once they exit school. Because of this, if there isn't careful planning and supports, autistic students might struggle with post-school options, including things like their ability to find competitive or supportive employment, whether or not they can access vocational training or secondary school opportunities, or even appropriate recreation and leisure activities. So there is some suggestions about what good transition programming should look like. According to Test and his colleagues, transition programming should include access to high quality instruction with appropriate and individualized accommodations. There has to be a specific focus on the kinds of things that students will be doing when they leave school. So it can't just be a random set of things that you focus on. It has to be connected to the opportunities that are going to be available. And in order to do this, it's good to have connections with community agencies for things like work study arrangements or vocational coursework that has direct relevance to community or opportunities that are in the community. So there is some research examining how autistic youth are doing once they leave school. There was a large national survey in the US called the National Longitudinal Transition Survey. There was a follow-up to that survey that ended in 2008. So it's a little bit dated, but the results specific to autistic students were published by Shattuck and colleagues in 2012. And they found that about 9% of respondents were receiving vocational or technical education. About 35% had some participation in 2 or 4-year college. 55%, so a little bit more than half, had received any paid employment between the time of school exit and the survey. And a really large number of participants, 40%, had not participated in anything following school exit. So this is a pretty big number of autistic people who don't have anything waiting for them when they leave school. And this does seem to be something that's specific to autistic people. The participation rates were lower for autistic adults as compared to adults with other disabilities. So we have some work to do in this area. Another important thing to note from that survey is that there do seem to be disparities in access to opportunities. Those who were from lower socioeconomic brackets and those who were non-white had were less likely to have participation in post-school activities. And as you might imagine, those students with higher functional skills had better access to employment and education. So a way to think about how we might improve these outcomes is to look at the existing intervention research for students in the transition period. So I'm going to discuss one framework for evaluating research, and it's the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice, which is a recent report from this group was just put out last year. And it's from colleagues at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So this project is an enormous project. It doesn't even just focus on transition age interventions. It focuses on all interventions available between, including early intervention and up to graduation. So, but they do disaggregate their findings by age. So we can look to this report and see what practices are considered evidence-based for transition age autistic youth. In order to receive a designation of evidence-based, they use this kind of scoring criteria. So there has to be at least 2 or more group design studies, which they consider high quality, conducted by 2 different research groups, or there can be 5 or more single case design studies conducted by at least 3 different investigators that have to have a total of at least 20 participants, or it can be a combination of group design and single case studies. So the practices that they have found or that they have categorized as evidence-based from this report, there were 26 different intervention strategies for transition age autistic youth. And about 17 of them were behavioral strategies. So things like discrete trial training, functional behavior assessment, what they call antecedent interventions, where they adjust the environment for students. I say about 17 because some of the intervention strategies weren't categorized according to the method of instruction. So there were categories like parent-mediated interventions or interventions that used alternative or augmentative communication. Those might have also used behavioral strategies, but they weren't categorized along that dimension. But you might be wondering, what do these researchers consider to be a high quality study? So this might be a little bit tough to see, but these are the scoring rubrics that they used for group design studies and for single case design studies. So a given study had to have all of these indicators to be considered high quality. For group designs, they considered things like whether or not there was a control group, whether or not the outcome measures had gone through some validation procedure, whether or not there were pre and post tests, the description of the comparison group. For single case studies, they looked at things like, does the research questions align with the design of the study? Did they report inter-observer agreement? Was there fidelity, intervention fidelity, was that tracked and reported, and did it achieve a certain threshold? However, there were a lot of things that they did not consider. So there were several threats to internal validity that would have, studies with these threats would have still been categorized as high quality. So while they did require for group design studies that there be a control group, they didn't require that participants were randomized between treatment and control. They also didn't consider the process of randomization. So sequence generation bias and allocation concealment have to do with whether or not the interventionist would know beforehand whether a given participant was assigned to treatment or control. Another big source of bias is detection bias. And this is when the assessors of the outcome measure are not masked. So they are aware of whether or not a participant is in a treatment or control condition. So all of these different things are big sources of bias that can lead to an intervention showing effects when in fact there are none. Another critique of the approach from this report is that it uses a procedure that is sometimes referred to as vote counting. So they just looked to see if they could locate the threshold number of studies showing an effect, whether 2 group design studies or 5 single case design studies. They didn't consider studies that had attempted to find an effect but didn't. And they also don't compute an effect size, which means that we don't have any information about the amount of gains that a child made as a result of the intervention. They also didn't attempt to identify gray literature, which is more likely to show no effects. And this procedure in general overestimates effectiveness. So it's possible that a given practice through the category could get a categorization of evidence-based that would actually show no significant effects if you used a meta-analytic procedure to estimate effectiveness. Another issue that my colleagues and I have been really concerned with is an assessment of the outcome variables on a couple of different dimensions. So one is whether the outcome variables is proximal or distal to the intervention procedure, and whether it's context-bound or generalized characteristics that are being measured. So proximity is the extent to which a variable measures outcomes that are broader or developmentally beyond what was directly taught in the intervention. So it's kind of like whether or not the outcome was whether or not the intervention procedures taught to the test. So for example, if an intervention taught a child to say hi when given a particular cue, and then the outcome was whether or not they said hi, that would be a proximal outcome. If they had taught the child to say hi, but then measured some broader language outcome, that would be distal. Boundedness is the extent to which the measurement context differs from the intervention context. So in single case designs, especially, intervention outcomes are measured in the intervention context. And when you use that measurement approach, you don't have any evidence that the outcomes continue outside of the intervention. So this is a problem for transition age autistic youth, because we know that they're in a period of their lives where they're going to be leaving these intervention contexts. So what we want to know is if there are outcomes that they're going to take with them beyond the intervention. So if outcomes are only measured that are proximal and context bound, we don't have much evidence that the outcomes are going to extend beyond the intervention period itself. So when the intervention stops, all of the gains made via the intervention also stop. Okay, so I think this is the last one. Another concern of this approach is that there isn't any serious consideration of adverse events. A previous iteration of this report did categorize some practices as potentially harmful, and they were things like auditory integration training or facilitated communication. So they didn't actually look to see whether primary studies had reported adverse events. They just looked to see if there was other evidence of adverse events not conducted by the primary researchers. So this means that for the bulk of the evidence that are comprise this report, we don't know whether or not the researchers have monitored or reported adverse events. Adverse events are any unfavorable or harmful outcomes that occurs during or after the intervention, but we don't necessarily know if the intervention caused it. And adverse effects are adverse events for which there is a reasonable relationship between the intervention and the event. So for example, if a autistic high school student injures themselves on a piece of equipment that was related to the intervention, we could reasonably assume that the injury was due to participation in the intervention. So that would be an adverse effect. So this brings us to the study that Shannon and I are just wrapping up with our colleagues. We wanted to look at all of the intervention research conducted on transition age autistic youth and provide some characterization of what these interventions are like. And then our big goals were to describe the quality of included studies using more rigorous quality risk of bias assessments than what has been done in previous evaluation studies. And we also wanted to characterize the outcome variables according to their proximity and boundedness. So based on our previous research that we've done with colleagues at UT Austin and Vanderbilt, that was conducted on younger autistic youth up to age 8, we assumed that there was going to be serious and significant risks of bias in this literature based on what we already knew going into this study. So we didn't have a goal of deriving summary effects unless this hypothesis was proven untrue and there was enough high quality intervention studies to warrant developing or computing a summary effect. Because if the research is poor quality, that means the summary effect that you derive isn't going to be particularly reliable. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it to Shannon, who's going to start by describing the methods of our current study.
Thank you, Kristen. Okay, so in collaboration with our university librarian at Boston College, we identified and conducted a search of 10 databases using the following relevant search terms. So a diagnosis of autism, transition age participants, and the studies had to implement an intervention. In addition, the search was also restricted to studies that were peer-reviewed, were published between 1970 and November 2020 when we conducted the search, and were published in English. So this search resulted in identification of 34,394 studies. So from there, we exported all of these studies into Mendeley Citation Manager, and we removed all of the duplicates. But even still, there were more than 30,000 studies that remained. From there, articles were exported into Abstractor, which is an online and organizational tool that allows you to screen titles and abstracts for systematic reviews. So we had 4 research assistants within, oh, go back. Okay, so we had 4 research assistants within the lab who were responsible for screening these abstracts. So when using the tool, a title of the study would appear and its corresponding abstract, and the screeners would be given the option to either include the study, exclude it, or say that they were unsure whether it should be included based on our inclusion criteria. We always erred on the side of caution. If we were unsure whether a title or abstract should be included, then we would always include it for further review. So we use the following inclusion criteria. Again, the studies had to be published in English in a peer-reviewed journal between 1970 and 2020. 70% or more of the participants had to have a diagnosis of autism, pervasive developmental disorder, or Asperger's syndrome. If there weren't 70% or more of these participants with these diagnoses, then outcomes had to be reported separately for the autistic participants. Participants had to be transition age. So we identified that as between 14 and 22 years. And the study had to be an experimental design that implemented an intervention. So it could either be single case design with a baseline and intervention phase, or a group design with control groups. So a randomized controlled trial or a quasi-experimental design. So in addition to the inclusion criteria, we also had exclusion criteria. So a study was excluded if their participants were reported to be in college and were no longer receiving transition-based services through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in the US. Again, I mentioned that we did remove duplicates, but some of those still remained even through our Mendeley screening. So we would then exclude them here under the abstract and title screening. So after title and abstract screening, 2,164 studies remained, and they went on for full text review using that same inclusion criteria that I just mentioned. So this round of screening involved skimming each individual PDF to determine whether it met that inclusion criteria that I just discussed. And ultimately, a total of 194 studies met our inclusion criteria and were included in the current study. So each of these 194 studies were double coded by myself, Kristen, and Dr. So-Yoon Kim, who was also heavily involved in this project. But we coded participant demographics, so things like age, IQ, mental age, gender. We coded intervention characteristics, so the setting of the intervention, where it took place. Was it at the participant's place of employment, in a school setting, in a clinic? We also coded the interventionist, so who was providing the intervention or the support strategies to the participants. Was it the peer, an employer or job coach, a clinician, a parent? And then finally, we coded the type of intervention, and I'll discuss that a bit more momentarily. To describe the quality of the studies, we used risk of bias assessments for group design and single case design studies. And again, I'll talk about those in more detail in just a bit. We also coded outcome features. So we distinguished between whether the outcome was measuring a discrete behavior, such as the number of tasks participants completed in a task analysis, or more global indicators, such as standardized instruments or rating scales or engagement states. We also coded the domain area of the outcome, or what exactly was being measured. So for example, social communication, academics, employment, or self-determination. And then we coded proximity and boundedness, which Kristen had already defined for you all. And then finally, we coded adverse events. So we identified whether authors monitored or reported adverse events, adverse aspects of the intervention, and we classified why participants withdrew from studies. So as Kristen mentioned earlier, one of the main goals of this project was to describe the quality of the included studies. So we use the RACOW tool for evaluating risk of bias in single case design research. And we use the Cochrane collaboration risk of bias tool that was developed by Higgins and colleagues to assess group design studies. So we coded risk of bias assessments as either low, unclear if the indicator was not mentioned in the study, or high. So I'm first going to describe 3 risk of bias indicators that are very similar across both group design and single case design studies. So those include selection bias or sequence generation, masking of participants and personnel, and masking of assessors and coders. Sequence generation for group design studies involves the randomization of participants to intervention and comparison groups. So we would code this as low if researchers described the exact way that they randomized the participants. So for instance, if they said that they flipped a coin to determine which group the participants would be in, we would have coded that as low. If participants were not randomized to either condition, we would have coded, in this case, the quality as high. Can you go to the next slide, Kristen? Thank you. Okay, so sequence generation for single case designs differs just a bit. This indicator has to do with whether it was randomly determined when the participants would receive the intervention. So if, for instance, the experimenters flipped a coin to determine when participants would receive the intervention phase, we would have coded this as low. But if, for example, researchers determined that they were going to provide the intervention after participants were in the baseline phase for 5 days, that's not random. We would have coded this risk of bias as high. So 2 additional indicators that are coded for both single case and group design research are performance bias and detection bias. So performance bias has to do with the masking of participants and personnel. So this is almost always high in autism research because the participants are going to be aware of whether they're receiving the intervention or support strategies. The only example that I can think of right now wasn't for transition age youth, but was an early intervention study where all participants entered a hyperbaric chamber. And one group of participants received the treatment. One group of participants were in a placebo group and they didn't receive the treatment. So in this case, none of the participants were aware of which intervention, whether they were receiving the intervention or the control. And so in this case, performance bias would be coded as low. But like I said, performance bias is almost always high in autism research, and that's okay. Detection bias is coded based on whether the assessors and coders are unaware of which condition the participants are assigned to. So if they're unsure which condition the participants are assigned to, detection bias would be coded as low. But for example, this often is the case in single case designs. The interventionist is providing the intervention and at the same time is measuring the outcome. So in this case, they're aware that the participant is receiving the intervention, and then detection bias we would have coded as high. So there are also several risk of bias indicators that are specific either to group design studies or single case design studies. So I'm going to briefly review those now. Given we don't have much time, I won't be going into too much detail. But allocation concealment refers to the process for determining assignment to intervention and comparison groups, ensuring that it's properly concealed. So investigators can't foresee the group assignment. into intervention or comparison conditions. Reporting bias refers to study attrition. So we would have coded this as low risk of bias if attrition was less than 20%, or if researchers imputed missing data. Selective reporting is coded as low if there's no reason to suspect that researchers selected specific outcomes to highlight in their study. This indicator would be coded as high if the researchers discussed a measure in the methods section, but never referred to that measure or those findings later on in the results or discussion. So there are also risk of bias measures that are specific to single case design studies. And I'll briefly review those now. So there's selection bias or participant selection. We would code this as low if there was a systematic method to determine whether the participants needed to receive the intervention. So for example, in a study, they could have, prior to the baseline phase, observe and systematically observe the target behavior and determine whether that participant actually needed to receive that intervention. In this case, we would have coded participant selection as low, a low risk of bias. Performance bias or procedural fidelity refers to the extent to which baseline and intervention phases were being implemented correctly. Dependent variable reliability refers to the procedures and reporting of reliability indices for outcome variables. So for this, inter-observer reliability had to be greater than 80% across multiple coders in at least 20% of conditions or outcomes or participants. So data sampling refers to the amount of data collected. Low risk of bias would mean that there was enough data that was sufficient to determine experimental control and functional relations. So we coded low risk of bias for data sampling as if there were 3 data points in each phase, so baseline phase, intervention phase, and there were 3 demonstrations of an effect. So for example, in a multiple baseline across participants single case design study, there would have to be 3 data points in the baseline phase, 3 in the intervention phase. The baselines would have to be staggered, and there would have to be three participants to compare the intervention to. And then finally, selective reporting just ensures that there's complete data for all participants who began the study and there's no missing data. If a participant dropped out or didn't complete a particular phase of the intervention, we would have coded selective reporting as high. We also inductively coded primary intervention type according to the direct supports that were being provided to the participants who were included in the study. So I'll just briefly review them. We would have coded an intervention as social cognitive if there was direct instruction or modeling that was used to improve the social skills of the participation. So an intervention like peers. We would have coded the intervention as facilitation in social context if it was implemented in the social context alongside other peers without disabilities to promote more naturalistic relationships between the autistic participants and their peers. So for example, a peer network intervention. Planning-based intervention centered on developing goals, plans, or vision statements for the student, usually in collaboration with teachers and family members. We coded interventions as behavioral if it relied on the manipulation of an antecedent or consequence of behavior to achieve an outcome. We coded the intervention type as video modeling as the primary intervention type if participants watched a video of a skill being performed and then were expected to demonstrate that skill independently. We only coded video modeling as a primary intervention type if there were no additional intervention strategies that were being provided to the participant. So there was no reinforcement from the interventionist or no support or scaffolding being provided. Interventions could also be coded as exercise or physical movement if participants engaged in structured physical activities in a group or individual context. In combination, if there were multiple types of support strategies that were being provided to the participants and they couldn't be classified into any of the intervention types that I just described. We also coded the features of the outcome. So we coded the outcome domain. We coded whether the outcome was a discrete or global indicator, whether it was proximal versus distal, as Kristen already discussed, and whether it was context-bound versus generalized. And finally, we coded adverse events. So we asked the following questions. Did the authors monitor or report adverse events or adverse effects? What were the total number of adverse events and effects monitored during the intervention? And what was the reason for participant withdrawal from the study? So was the reason that participants withdrew from the studies due to an adverse event? So on to our findings. Across the 194 studies that were included in our systematic review, there were 1,278 outcomes. But the findings related to intervention and outcome types were coded during a second round of coding. So these findings are more preliminary. So far, we've coded 100 studies that have a total of 726 outcomes. More than half of the outcomes were from studies that implemented behavioral interventions. I do want to point out that this figure does not have a label for planning-based interventions or exercise and physical movement intervention. So it's that small slice on the figure. And that's because less than 1% of the outcomes were from studies that implemented either of these interventions. 84% of the outcomes were discrete behavior, most of which were measuring verbal and social behavior. So things such as initiations, responses, number of questions asked. Out of the 115 non-discrete outcomes, the most common were, so these are the more global indicators, the most common were employment outcomes, so such as whether the participant was employed, their hourly wages, how many hours did they work. So next, I want to point out some of the rather troubling findings for both single case design studies and group design research that we have coded. So first I want to highlight that there were 181 single case design studies with 1,173 outcomes across those studies. So almost all of the studies did not describe whether the procedure at which participants received the intervention was random. So that's the sequence generation right there. So you can see the unclear risk of bias is that yellow bar, and the red risk of bias or high risk of bias is that red bar. So yellow and red are both problematic, and you want to see more green on the graph. So again, selection bias or sequence generation bias was unclear or high in most cases. And you can see performance bias, that fully red bar right there, is almost always high. And so we talked about that, and that's because masking of participants and personnel is very likely in autism research. So that's okay. But then moving on to detection bias or masking of assessors and coders. Assessors and coders are rarely ever naive to group assignment of the participants. So in single case designs, as we discussed previously, it's often the case that the interventionist who is implementing the intervention is also in that same context measuring the outcome. So in this case, the assessors and coders would know that the participant was receiving the intervention. And then finally, data sampling, that bar in the bottom, is also problematic. So many studies that we included and encoded here do not include 3 data points per phase or don't have 3 demonstrations of an effect. So there were 13 group design studies with a total of 105 outcomes. So again, those top 2 bars, selection bias, sequence generation, and allocation concealment, researchers rarely ever describe the method at which participants are randomized to intervention or comparison groups. So that's problematic. Again, performance bias, that red bar right there, that's okay because in autism research, participants are rarely ever naive to the group that they're assigned to. Masking of assessors and coders, so that's that next bar that's being pointed to. This is also problematic because assessors and coders in this case are aware of the group that participants are in. So they are aware that they're receiving the intervention and then they're measuring the outcome as well. So you can see here that outcomes are almost always proximal, so they're almost always directly taught in the intervention, and most often context bound. So outcomes are being measured in a similar or identical context as the intervention. And then finally, I know we're running out of time here, but I do want to mention our findings on adverse events. So only 4 out of 194 studies reported that participants did not experience an adverse event. So an example of that is a study that reported video modeling did not result in negative side effects. The remaining 190 studies never mentioned adverse events. And none of the studies reported an active monitoring plan for adverse events. None of the studies monitored or reported adverse effects during the intervention. So that's when adverse events are directly related or caused by the intervention. And then finally, we classified reasons for participant withdrawal. So there were 11 studies that mentioned that participants withdrew from their particular study, 3 of which it was unclear why the participants withdrew. 4 out of 194 studies were not due to an adverse event. So that could have been the participant moved out of state, for example. And then finally, 4 out of the 194 studies, the reasons for withdrawal were due to an adverse event, but it wasn't an adverse effect. So it wasn't directly related to the intervention. So this could have been, for example, that the participant was sick and could no longer participate in the intervention.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. So I'll just go over very briefly some of the things that we've concluded from these findings. So we have a lot of work to do. The studies that we reviewed, there are numerous concerns about internal validity. Very few studies had masked assessors, and this was true for both single case and group designs. Most studies don't report or use randomization procedures. There's data sampling concerns in single case designs. So we think that it is questionable the extent to which any of the interventions that are included in this research can be considered evidence-based. So what does it mean to have interventions designated as evidence-based when the quality of the research providing that evidence is really low? There's also concerns with the outcome variables. There were very few distal and generalized outcomes, and we think this is especially concerning for transition age students because, like we've said, these supports are not going to follow autistic students when they graduate. So if the outcomes that we are able to show change on are limited to when the intervention is actually being provided, this doesn't tell us much about how autistic students are gonna do once they leave school. And then we also thought it was interesting that just over a quarter of outcomes focused on employment or daily living skills, which are things that are specific to the transition period. So there doesn't seem to be a big pivot when autistic students are transition age to focus on things that are particular to that period. And as Shannon just mentioned, there's almost no attempt to monitor or report adverse events, which is very similar to what we found in intervention research on younger children. Because of this, there isn't a very, there's no basis by which to select transition supports for particular students. So ideally, you would be able to weigh evidence of potential positive effects of an intervention with the potential for adverse events. The evidence for positive effects has a lot of shortcomings, and there just isn't any, collection of evidence for adverse events. So we are unable to make those decisions because we don't have enough information. So researching potential adverse events and long-term harms is an urgent need in this area of research. And that's it for our talk. We want to say thank you to our colleagues who worked with us on this project. So Yoon Kim, Vicky Yu, Sarah Mohudian, Philip Postek, and Rachel McKinney. And that's it for us. So we would be happy to take some questions if we have any time left.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for a really, really interesting talk, a huge amount of work that you've done to work through that literature. And it was particularly nice actually to get a bit of a tutorial as well on intervention research and also the process of doing a systematic review, which I think will be particularly helpful. I know we've got lots of students on the call today who'd be considering doing systematic review work or be looking into transition research. So it'd be really interesting for them. So thank you very, very much for that. We do have some questions that have come in. I'm hoping we'll get through at least a few of them. The first one, why did you decide to evaluate research focusing on transition-related interventions? Is that because perhaps research in this area tends to be particularly biased? I know you looked at, was it under 8s in Project AIM? So why was it transition in particular for this one?
Shannon, do you want to take that one?
Say it again.
Do you want to take this one?
Sure. So we wanted to focus on transition interventions, one, because I think it's very unclear which interventions are being provided to students at the transition age. I think we wanted to gain a sense of what types of interventions were being provided to students who are transition age. Were they focusing specifically on transition related skills that could be further helpful as students transition and prepare to transition into various adult contexts?
I think just to add to that, Laura, I think you're right that our perception is that transition age is kind of a neglected area in autism research. Just as a comparison, in this study, we found 13 group design studies. In the Project AIM study that focused on kids up to age 8, there were almost 150. So if randomized control trials are the gold standard or group design studies, there are almost 10, there are more than 10 times as many for younger kids as compared to transition age kids. So we just wanted to get a better sense of what is actually out there in this literature.
Totally. And I guess with the statistics that you presented at the start about the really, 40% of young people, have nothing there when they leave school. I guess that's just such an important age to focus on as well. We've got another question come in. How many of the studies included in the review included things like the goals of the person, quality of life, their satisfaction, and aspects like that?
That is a really good question. I think the answer is none. Shannon, you might know if there's one or two.
So like I said in the methods section, we haven't finished coding the intervention and outcome characteristics, but as of right now, there aren't many that are, I don't think there are any that focused on quality of life, self-determination, et cetera.
Gosh, and another kind of linked question about the kind of transition intervention research, whether it's done on a longitudinal basis with any follow-up. Is it very much fixed at a certain time point, or what kind of things are we seeing in this research?
Yeah, that's another good question. Shannon, I'll let you talk about the group design studies, but for the single case design studies, there is often a follow-up phase. So the intervention will stop. We found follow-up phases. I think the longest follow-up phase was probably like 6 months. Usually it's a couple weeks after the intervention has stopped. However, the way single case design studies measure follow-up phases, they usually just use it as an add-on, and they'll have one data point that isn't staggered. So you cannot actually propose a causal relation between the intervention and that follow-up marker, because it doesn't follow the rules of single case logic, strangely enough. So even though follow-up and what they call maintenance, maintenance is another word for follow-up, and they sometimes have generalization probes, they're not particularly informative because they don't follow the rules of single case design logic. They're just like this add-on at the end. So even though there are many of them in single case design research, you can't actually attribute the effects to the intervention itself, which is a strange kind of thing. Shannon, do you remember any for the group design studies?
I want to say that the longest follow-up time point was 1 year after the intervention had concluded for those group design studies.
Brilliant, thank you both. So we've got lots of questions. It's deciding which one to go to next. One of them was about whether there was a type of bias that might have come up unusually regularly or was particularly notable. And they've also asked whether you have any suggestions going forward. How do we minimise these kind of risks in autism research?
Good question, Shannon.
Yeah. I was just going to ask you, do you want to take that? Or?
Okay, I can do it. I think that the two risks of bias that I think we are kind of fixated on are I guess it's more than two, because one is randomization. We need studies that are appropriately randomized. There are the risk of bias tool for single case design studies did include an indicator for randomization, but we didn't see a single case design that used any randomization procedures, which we thought was a bit striking. I think the randomization procedures are more common in group designs, but there's a problem with researchers not explaining what they did. So that's one. The other one that I think is a really big deal is detection bias. So when assessors know what phase of the student is in, I think that's a big problem, because there's research showing, for example, that when parents are given an assessment and they're told that their child is receiving intervention, they will show intervention effects even if there wasn't one. So just because the informant knew that, or they were lied to, but just because they thought that their child was receiving an intervention, it produced an effect. So we know that detection bias is a serious threat to internal validity. And I think it's concerning that almost all of the studies conducted in this age group are subject to detection bias. So any claims of effectiveness could be solely due to this issue of detection bias. And I think another thing that I think is specifically problematic is that if it's the researcher who developed the intervention, who is also the assessor, there's a conflict of interest there, because they have a motivation to show that the intervention that they've worked so hard on worked. So they all kind of come together with these designs that are producing spurious effects.
And perhaps worst of all, from some of your other research showing that actually lots of conflicts of interest aren't even declared.
Exactly. We did not look at conflicts of interest, but I don't remember seeing any declarations of conflicts of interest in this work. Well, there might have been a few here and there, but in autism research writ large, those conflicts of interest don't tend to be declared.
So I think there's lots of work to do. Right, we've got a couple more questions before we finish up. One was referred to as a kind of cultural context question. So I think at the start you mentioned that young people can access transition services, I think up to the age of 22, but it can be state dependent. And one of the questions is that would academically able students be able to continue receiving transition services? Does it vary depending on the student and their needs or academic abilities and things like that?
Shannon, you want to take that?
Yeah, so if students with disabilities are on an IEP or an individualized education program, they can continue, so they have a disability, they can continue to be receiving services up until their 22nd birthday in the US. And once they hit that mark, they no longer receive any services, and they're often, they go on to adulthood, whatever that context may look like. And it's particularly problematic because students with disabilities or autistic students are not being prepared during the transition planning process. And so oftentimes there's a huge gap, and because autistic students aren't receiving appropriate supports, they aren't prepared for those adulthood contexts. But to answer your question, it's students who are on an IEP or receiving services, they can receive those services until they're 22 years old, and then those services end on their birthday.
Thank you.
We've had to follow up on that.
Yeah.
So it is true that not all students do receive services until 22. If some students are on a diploma track, and often those students receive, they graduate high school at the same age as their peers, so 17 or 18. So it does look different in terms of how long students stay, depending on the levels of support that they need.
Yeah, and many students can also be in a transition related program. So they may be in like the university or college context as well, but still receiving supports in the high school setting. So it just depends on the support needs of the student.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think a big issue there, I mean, we have it in the UK, no matter where the age is, there is this cliff edge, and it's what do we do about it? There's one more question I wanted to ask, and it links to something I think that we hear a lot from the schools that we work with, which is that, if there's lots of these issues with the intervention research, we can't necessarily wait until we have, really high quality studies. We've got these young people who are finishing school and need support now. What would your advice be for practitioners, for parents, for people in the field about how to select kind of supports interventions for autistic young people?
I think that's a really excellent question. I think when we conclude this project, we'll probably try to do what we did for the Project AIM work, which was to select some what looks like the best quality studies. Even if there are major flaws, can we identify one or two studies that has the fewest of those? I always tell my students, in my work as a associate professor, I train future teachers, future special educators, and I tell them that the popularity of any given intervention is inversely proportional to the evidence supporting it. So I do think that dispelling some thoughts about what is the most supported intervention would be helpful. Some people might think that it might be considered common knowledge that a particular approach has the most support behind it because we're used to just counting the number of studies. So I think saying, well, actually, that's not true if you look at quality, gives a helpful frame of reference for people to be able to say, I suspected that approach maybe wasn't working for us, but it's probably not the students, it's not because of the student that they're not making progress if that's the case. It's because the evidence for this intervention is actually not that good. So it might just be helpful to know a better reading of what the evidence says. And another thing I think is that a lot of transition supports require removing students from their peers and putting them in segregated settings. I think it would be helpful to know that there's not a whole lot of evidence for approaches that do that. So maybe we can say there's really you're going to have a really good reason to decide to segregate students. The evidence we have for interventions that do that isn't very good. So maybe we could do less of, we might think that we have to do these procedures that require segregation because that's what's most likely to produce gains, but that might not be true.
Yeah, I also think what's problematic is like you saw in the findings that I demonstrated, there are very few interventions that are focused on planning-based, IEP meetings, self-determination, and so that's particularly problematic. And I think a lot of what could be helpful to students who are preparing to transition to adulthood would be connecting them with outside agencies, employment agencies, post-secondary education opportunities, et cetera. But we don't have much research on that.
So lots of work to do, but really encouraging that there are some helpful signposts, I think, for people. Right, we've come up to 5 p.m. in the UK. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. Just to say a huge thanks to both of you for your really brilliant presentation. and for kicking off our new series of the Cray webinars in style. I want to say as well a huge thank you to the Cray team who've provided amazing support behind the scenes, and a big thank you to everyone that's joined. If you take a look at our website, cray.ioe.ac.uk, you can see details of all of our future webinars featuring a real array of amazing researchers and advocates. And next month's webinar is by a Cray alumnus, Alyssa Alcorn, who's at the University of Edinburgh. And their talk will be entitled, "What does it mean to teach about neurodiversity at school, and how can we do that?" That's on Thursday, December 2nd at 4 p.m. UK time. So thanks very much, everyone, and we hope to see you there.
Thank you so much. We love
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you.